Hi everyone, welcome back to Government 2305. This is part 2 of the lecture on political parties. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, our next subject within this topic is American third parties. First and foremost, why are third parties important? Well, even though America has been defined as a two-party system, it has always had some third parties. So who are they? Well, if you follow the live link on the actual PowerPoint itself that is on your Canvas module, you can see who some of the most popular and biggest third parties are. Now, third parties are parties that organize to compete against the two major American parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And by organizing, they are giving voice to issues that are unattended or maybe unimportant to the major parties. These are issues that do not get the spotlight. And third parties have influenced America's ideas and elections. And important third parties and independents have included the populists, the progressives, the Reform Party, and even the Green Party. In 1998, a Reform Party member by the name of Jesse Ventura, a former professional wrestler, was elected governor of the state of Minnesota. So we see that some third parties have enjoyed an influence far beyond their electoral size, such as the progressives, but it is these types of parties that are later absorbed by the other parties, right, by the Democrats in this case. Now, these third parties are absorbed or are important because large parts of their programs, large parts of their concerns are then adopted by one or both of the major parties who are looking to appeal to the third-party voters. And thus they mobilize a new group of people from these third parties to vote for the mainstream too. So this is one of the problems or one of the reasons why third parties have such a short lifespan. Integration into major parties is the biggest explanation for why we don't see more third parties or why third parties have a short life from organization to elections. They're good to mobilize a certain group of people, and then the major parties come in and adopt their platforms and thus lure their voters away from them. Now, can they win? Well, most Americans believe that only candidates from major parties can win an election, and that voting for a third party is a waste of a vote. However, under federal election law, any minor party receiving more than 5% of the presidential vote is entitled to federal funds. Thus, third parties continue to thrive. But there are issues that hamper third parties. And one of those is that in the United States, we have single-member districts. So what this means is that an electorate is allowed to select one representative from each district. This is the normal method of the American representation system. So in the United States, the U.S. is divided up into House districts and into Senate districts, right? The Senate districts are easy. That means each state gets 2 representatives. However, the House districts are single-member districts. So the person with the most votes wins, and one person represents the entire district. So it makes it very difficult for a third-party representative or a third-party member to be able to win a single member district. Now, in other nations, there is a system of multiple member districts. This means that an electorate, the people, select candidates at large from the entire district. Each voter casts a number of votes equivalent to the number of seats to be filled. So if each district has 3 members that they need to fill seats for, then however many people want to can run for office, and on election day you go in and vote for 3 people. Chances are good that the top 3 with the highest votes would be the representatives. This type of system gives several individuals the opportunity to be elected to represent each legislative district, thus allowing for the opportunity for third parties to be successful. Now, in a voting plurality system, in this, the electorate, this system is one in which to win a seat in the representative body, a candidate needs to receive only the most votes in the election, not necessarily a majority of votes cast. So this sets a high victory threshold, and candidates must secure more votes than they would if they were in a system of proportional representation. And this is because proportional representation is a multiple member district system that allows each political party representation in proportion to its percentage of the total vote. So if out of 1,000 votes in a district, 50% were Republican and 50% were Democrats, then we would have a proportional representation for that 50-50 split. So for example, in the US, a candidate needs 50% of the votes cast. In Europe, a candidate may need only 20% at most. And this American feature discourages minor parties because it becomes very difficult for minor parties to have enough members to not only show up and vote, but to then try to convince others to vote along with you. Now, when you go to vote and when you are talking about political parties, there are psychological ties that play into joining or being a member of a particular political party. And this is what is called your voters' psychological ties. Now, party identification is an individual's voter psychological ties to one party or another. So this means that each and every one of you, as individuals, develop party identification with the party that reflects your interests. Now, recently, and here more so in the last 4 to 8 years, American partisan ties have declined, but Americans continue to identify with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And this is because party identification gives voters a stake in the election, making it attractive for voters to go to the polls. Now, strong party identifiers become activists, and activists are the participants who contribute time, energy, and efforts to support their party and its candidates. So, as part of your party's identification and part of your voters' psychological ties, you have to consider the factors that are associated with this, such as characteristics that include race, ethnicity, gender, religion, class, ideology, and as simple as the region that they come from or that they are trying to identify and represent. So for psychological ties, and to go along with the party identification, there are 2 ideology tests that you can take. Of course, these links will be live on the PowerPoint that is located in your Canvas module. I want you to, as part of this political parties unit, to go through, click through the links on the PowerPoint and take both tests. They're for fun. They're for you to see if you identify with the party that you think you do. You don't have to let me know what you find out unless you want to. But these tests are set up so that you can answer the questions, and then the way you answer your questions, I will allow you to be given an idea of which party you have stronger ties to. There's 2 different tests, so pick one, pick both, and figure it out. Do you have the same psychological ties to the party that you think you identify with? Now, voter decisions. This is very important when it comes to political parties. What are voters' decisions based on? Well, voter decisions are based on party, issues, and candidates. The ultimate decision on who wins elections is made by you, the voter. However, there are 3 factors which can influence voters' decisions at the polls. Partisan loyalty is one of those factors. Now, most voters identify with a major political party. This partisan identification predisposes many voters in favor of their party's candidate and against those of the opposing parties. At the level of presidential races, issues and candidates' personalities may become very important. Partisanship is more likely to assert itself in the less visible races where less is known about the candidates, and we were able to see these types of partisan loyalty when you go to the polls and you were able to just straight ticket voting, meaning that you could just push one button and vote for all Democrats or vote for all Republicans. And we saw that happen a lot in previous elections. This is what we consider partisan loyalty. You will vote for the person that you know, regardless of party. However, for those that you don't know, that you do not have a strong association with, you will pick the person that is Republican or that is Democratic instead of choosing by their policy, their stance, or just their character. Now, the next factor that can influence voters' decisions are the issues, and issues can shape an election. Most voters tend to cast their votes for those candidates they perceive to have their outlook or share their outlook on economic policy, foreign policy, or on social or moral issues. Voting on issues involves a mixture of the voter's judgment about the party's past behavior and hopes and fears about the party's future behavior. So this is where the issues come in, whether it's the environment, Social Security, healthcare. These are the types of issues that can be important and that can shape an election. Lastly, we have candidate characteristics. And candidate characteristics have become more important in this modern age, especially in this age of social media and just media in general. Before, when it was radio, newspapers before radio, you didn't see the candidates. You heard them maybe during the age of radio. You read about them in newspapers. But once television came about, well, it changed the game. You are now able to see the person, judge them on their mannerisms, on how they spoke, on how they looked, on how they acted. And with social media, it has become even more important because everybody has a camera, everybody has a recording device on their person at all times, and things have come out of the woodwork, right? So you see candidate characteristics become more and more important. And it's because a candidate's personal attributes have always influenced voters' decisions. The most important characteristics affecting voters, of course, are still race, ethnicity, religion, and social background. Voters also pay attention to their personality characteristics, such as decisiveness, honesty, and vigor. Now, voter turnout. American voter turnout, meaning the percentage of eligible individuals who actually vote, is relatively low. The American system overwhelmingly counts on electoral participation to take direction. As a result, suffrage, and suffrage is the right to vote, this is also called the franchise, is by law available for all American citizens over the age of 18. Now, election participation studies show turnout has declined. These studies also conclude that the least well-off Americans are the least likely to participate, and the most advantaged are most likely to vote. The difference between American and European levels of turnout has much to do with registration rules and party strength. So, voter turnout in the U.S. has always been low, relatively low. The fact that we got over 150 million people to come out and vote in last year's presidential election was unprecedented. So we see that these low levels of voter turnout, part of the problem is that the electoral process has many levels and rules. Primary elections are elections, and this is one of those many levels. Primary elections are elections used to select each party's candidates for the general election. In the case of local and statewide offices, the winners of primary elections face one another as their party's nominees in the general election. At the presidential level, however, primary elections are indirect because they are used to select state delegates to the national nominating conventions, at which the major party presidential candidates are chosen. So this is one of those many levels. Now, the primary system was introduced at the turn of the century by progressive reformers who hoped to weaken the power of party leaders by taking candidate nominations out of their hands. In a closed primary, which is under the laws of most states, only registered members of a political party may vote in a primary election to select that party's candidates. In an open primary, states allow all registered voters to decide on the day of the primary in which party's primary they will participate. Now, the primary here in the state of Texas is held in the spring. So this is that initial selection of candidates for the general election. So primary elections are in the spring, general elections are then in November. Now, the primary election, of course, is then followed by the general election. This is the decisive electoral contest. The winner of the general election is elected to office for a specified term. 24 states also provide for referendum voting. Now, the referendum process is the practice of referring a measure proposed or passed by a legislature to the vote of the people for approval or rejection. 18 states also have legal provisions for recall elections. The recall is an electoral device introduced by turn of the 20th century populists that allow voters to remove public officials from office by popular vote prior to the expiration of their term. Now, federal officials such as the President, members of Congress, are not subject to recall. Now, the Electoral College still organizes presidential elections. The Electoral College is made up of electors from each state who meet after the popular election to cast ballots for president and vice president. This is a product of indirect elections where voters choose an intermediate body to select public officials. Now, on election day, American voters are not voting directly for the president. So this past November, we did not vote directly for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Instead, we were voting to choose electors selected by the state's party to support and cast their vote for the party's presidential candidate. The two exceptions to this rule are Maine and Nebraska, which each can provide their one electoral vote goes to the winner in each congressional district, and 2 electoral votes go to the winner statewide. So there are 538 electoral votes in the U.S. Electors can cast their vote for the other party's candidates, but in all but 3 occasions, these votes have ratified the national popular vote. So electors cast their vote in the state's capital and then send them to Congress, who then formally announces the winner. If there is no majority winner, then the top 3 candidates would be submitted to the House, where each state gets 1 vote to pick the winner. And as difficult as the election of 2020 was to figure out, the Electoral College, of course, always comes up as an obsolete use and calls for reform. Now, whether that happens is totally up to Congress, of course, because it is in the Constitution, so the Constitution would have to be amended. But keep that in mind as we go through this course, that there are still parts of our government that we are using that we may need to reform or maybe do away with completely because of its outdated modes and requirements. Now, when it comes to elections and politics in particular, money has played a major role and will continue to do so in the future. So modern national political campaigns are fueled by enormous amounts of money. In a national race, tens of millions of dollars are spent on media time, if not more, on public opinion polls, and on media consultants. So, who donates? Well, money can come from a multitude of sources. And be aware, as I just said, money is the mother's milk of politics. Money is probably the most important thing when it comes to running for office, to politics in general, and to political parties in particular. So who donates? Well, first and foremost, we have individual donors, me and you. Politicians spend a great deal of time asking people for money. Many contribute greatly, but only as donors, not only as donors, but also as fundraisers. They donate via candidate contribution, political action committees, and party committees. So, political action committees, PACs, what are they? Well, these organizations were established by corporations, labor unions, interest groups, even individuals to channel contributions into political campaigns. By law, PACs, they can make large campaign contributions to individuals, and these are larger contributions than you and I can make to a person running for office. Now, individuals can donate a maximum of $2,300 to a candidate, but a PAC can donate as much as $5,000. And party committees can donate $25,000 to each candidate. So you see the disparity in money, and before too long, those numbers add up. Now, the candidates. By law, individuals have the right to spend their own money to campaign for office. Therefore, wealthy individuals often contribute millions of their own money to their campaigns. Now, independent spending, or 527 committees and 501c4s. These are committees who are independent groups that are not covered by the campaign spending restrictions imposed by the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Acts. These groups are named for the sections of the tax code under which they are organized. Now, each of these committees can raise and spend unlimited amounts on political advocacy so long as their efforts are not coordinated with those of any individual or particular candidate's campaign. Lastly, public funding. The Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA, provides for public funding of presidential campaigns. As they seek the presidential nomination, candidates are eligible for dollar-to-dollar matching public funds by raising at least $5,000 in individual contributions of $200 or less. Candidates who do not accept public funding are not bound by expenditure limits and can therefore spend more. In recent years, most candidates have opted to fund their own campaigns, thereby being able to spend unlimited amounts of money. So the current system, is it good or bad for democracy? Well, the important role played by private funds in the U.S. affects the balance of power among contending social groups. Politicians need large sums of money to campaign successfully. This fact inevitably ties their interest to the interests of the groups and forces that provide this campaign money. In the U.S., these contributors represent business groups, labor groups, environmental groups, pro-choice, and right-to-life forces. Interests that donate large sums expect and often receive favorable treatment from the beneficiaries of their largesse. Not all American interests play a role in political campaign finance. Only those with a great deal of money do, thus not reflecting the diversity of American society. The poor, the disadvantaged, and the destitute also have an interest in political campaign outcomes, but who is to speak for them? So, keep that in mind when you read or research or watch the news or see something that catches your eye on the net. And remember that when you go to vote. You know, who speaks for these people who cannot afford or who are not being equitably represented? The disadvantaged, the poor, the destitute, those that are considered less in our society. So, is the current system good or bad for our democracy? Well, that's up to you to ponder on and decide. So I will leave you with that question. I hope to interact with you again in class, and be sure you come back for our next topic. Until then, thanks.